On today's show, it is a preseason divisional preview with Heather Engel of NHL.com, Buffalo Sabres correspondent. We are going to discuss the Buffalo Sabres offseason moves after just falling short of the postseason, how they compare with Ottawa and Detroit as well. Is Devon Levi the guy? And will the Buffalo Sabres make the postseason?
You're Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into this Thursday, October 12th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. I'm Armando Velez from the Hockey News, and you can follow me on X at MonoMan12. Follow the show account on X and Instagram at LO_FLA Panthers. And shout out to the everydayers who come back here and get your daily Florida Panthers fix. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more right now. New customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/Locked On to get started. More about FanDuel a little bit later in the show, but right before the start of the season, if you have been listening to the show for a while, you have seen many different episodes bringing in different personalities in previewing the Atlantic Division rivals for the Florida Panthers. But for today's show, we are bringing in Heather Engel, NHL correspondent for the Buffalo Sabres, here on the show. And Heather, thank you so much for coming on to the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanna first start off with what was, once Game 82 ended for the Buffalo Sabres last season, what was the feeling like for the organization and the team? I know the Pegula family has invested a lot with the. I know they're also the same owners of the Buffalo Bills and them making the postseason, but with falling just short, I mean, they were basically eliminated in Game 81 of the season, which the Florida Panthers also clinched that same night. But what was the feeling like once Game 82 was over for the Buffalo Sabres?
They were disappointed. They came that close with, a couple of bad stretches, one in November and one through February, and they managed to claw their way into being, a point behind the Panthers and being that close to making the playoffs. It sort of left a sour, bitter taste in their mouths. They believed that they could make it, and that's what their motivation is for this year, is that they were that close and they're only going to get better. So they were, they were very disappointed that they didn't make it.
Yeah, and still, this team is in the middle of a pretty long playoff drought, which they passed the Panthers after the Panthers went from 2001 to 2012 not making the postseason. But we'll get more into the whole postseason conversation a little later in the show. But there is a lot of transactions as far as the Buffalo Sabres. A good majority of their pieces came back into the mix. Rasmus Dahlin got an extension, 8 times 11 million. You bring in some leaders of Eric Johnson to play on that bottom pair on the defense, as well as Connor Clifton from the Boston Bruins as well. But there's also one player who I want to discuss, who was recently drafted as recently as Zach Benson, 13th overall from the Winnipeg Ice. Talk about the excitement level of him and the preseason that he had, because I'm going to be truthful. I did not watch much Buffalo Sabres hockey during the preseason. So tell us from your perspective as the NHL correspondent what you've seen out of that, and also the other offseason move to bring some leadership in to this organization.
We'll start with Benson. I mean, their plan for him was he'll play a few games and then they'll send him back to his team now in Wenatchee in the WHL. But he just they figured 3 games. That's what they did with Matt Savoy last year, 3 games or so. And then at the second week of camp, they returned him to junior. But Benson just has really impressed. I mean, the notice on him was he's got that tenacity. He's got the offensive skill, but he's got that tenacity. He's a hound on the puck. And for an 18-year-old kid, he's got the defensive awareness, which is tough for any guy at any age, but he has it at such a young age that he's managed well. And so he ended up playing, I think, 6 of the 7 games that they had, and he earned himself a spot. Like Kevin Adams and Don Granato said, they weren't going to hand him a spot. It's, they wanted to be forced into making hard decisions, and he did that. And he sort of in a way benefited from his own play, and also the absence of Jack Quinn and Matt Savoy getting hurt in the prospects tournament. That sort of opened the door a sliver, but they still had extra forwards. They still had prospects that were pushing for the NHL, and it was Zach Benson that just bulldozed his way through to earn that spot. And it didn't matter who he was playing with, whether it was Tate Thompson and Jeff Skinner or Casey Middlestat and Jordan Greenway. He's played his game and earned his spot on the roster. And then, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
And then for the veterans, they needed some help on their penalty kill, and Eric Johnson and Connor Clifton will do that. And I mean, Eric Johnson, he's been through a team that's trying to bounce through that, get through out of that rebuild, go from rebuild to playoff contention to Stanley Cup contention. So he's going to provide a lot of knowledge and experience that these guys, they don't have. There's only a handful. Alex Tuck and Kyle Okposo, maybe Jordan Green is playing the playoffs, I'm not sure, but there's only barely a handful who have tasted the playoffs. So last year's little run gave the rest of the guys a little experience of playoff-like games, and now they'll get to learn exactly how to handle things even more.
Yeah, and it's funny because those matchups between the Florida Panthers and the Buffalo Sabres towards the end of the season, the February game where the Panthers forward Anthony Duclair came back into the mix right before the trade deadline. That loss seemed like a big dent into the Florida Panthers season. And then a few months later, it was it felt like the opposite when the Florida Panthers defeated the Buffalo Sabres in that matchup. Not necessarily mathematically eliminating them, but putting a little bit of dent in the playoff hopes as well. And you mentioned bringing back their captain Kyle Okposo, a necessary leader for them. You mentioned Matthew Savoy starting on season opening IR for the Buffalo Sabres. No Jack Quinn to start the season as well, but also the years of rebuilding and assets as well for the Buffalo Sabres. I mean, from my count, I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 first round picks from the organization, and then bringing in guys outside of the organizations via trade, whether it was the Jack Eichel trade or the Ryan O'Reilly trade. I'm talking about Tage Thompson and Alex Tuck. What does that say about just the front office and the coaching staff? I know Don Granato has been the head coach for not that long, but what does that say about what they're trying to build here?
Well, what Kevin Adams has said from the beginning, he has a plan, and he's being patient with his plan, and he's not going to try to rush, things just to get to somewhere quicker. That was the issue with previous regimes. They saw, glimpses of hope, and then they quickly tried to put pieces in that maybe weren't the right pieces or weren't there at the right time or whatnot. Kevin Adams has made it a point we're going to let these guys grow together and learn together. That's the best way for them to get to the next step. Let these guys learn, and then, not everyone's going to last through the contention. There's going to be guys that are going to move out in and out, and that's something else the group is going to have to learn to deal with is guys, close teammates, because they're a very, very tight-knit group. But so guys that are basically your brothers are going to be leaving at some point, whether, not by choice, and they're going to have to deal with that. But they've now got stability from front office, coaching standpoint, and in the room. And it's this is the start of my 6th season. It's a completely different vibe.
Mm-hmm. No doubt. And for the Buffalo Sabres, you talk about even high drafted players like a Jack Quinn spent some time in the AHL, and even the pick that the Buffalo Sabres used from the Sam Reinhart trade with the Florida Panthers and Yuri Kulich. It looks like that he's going to spend a little bit of time with the Rochester Americans this year. So we're seeing more of that patient approach that that you were saying as far as that, even though Yuri Kulich had a great World Junior just a few seasons ago. But we're going to transition over to our second segment here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, where we're going to discuss more about the goalie situation for the Buffalo Sabres. So we are going to discuss that next here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. But first, we're going to tell you all about FanDuel Sportsbook and snap into the action this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better place to get into the action. The app is super easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options, including the spreads, player props, over-unders, and so much more. So you can maybe place your bets on possibly the Buffalo Sabres making a postseason appearance, or the Florida Panthers making it back to the postseason. Maybe you could see cup run as well. As far as that, you could find that all on FanDuel.com. So visit FanDuel.com/locked on to kick off the NHL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. Segment number 2 here on this Thursday, October 12th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day here on a Thursday. And once again, another episode here where we're bringing in a personality based on coverage of an Atlantic Division foe for the Florida Panthers. We have Heather Engel here of NHL.com Buffalo Sabres correspondent here. And Heather, and this is something that interests Florida Panther fans so much, and definitely interests me as someone who watches this team every single day. And just a few seasons ago, when the Buffalo Sabres were starting to go into their new direction as far as young talent as well, Jack Eichel was out of the picture. We mentioned Ryan O'Reilly as well, and then Sam Reinhart being one of them. Sam Reinhart's performance, for the most part, was a lot better when Jack Eichel got hurt too. He started to really take into shape, and then of course earned himself a contract with the Florida Panthers. The 32 power play goals in the last 2 seasons, which is a Florida Panthers record for a 2-season span. But the other part of that trade is a big one for the Buffalo Sabres side of things, and that is the 7th round pick, Devon Levi. And it's crazy. Even before that trade happened, Spencer Knight versus Devon Levi, Panthers goaltender versus Panthers goaltender, USA versus Canada, where Spencer Knight got the best of that one, winning gold for Team USA. And now with that trade, and Devon Levi being in the top 10 in the Hobie Baker voting as well, from Northeastern, and then coming into the mix late into the season, and now no Craig Anderson, former Florida Panther goalie as well, and now him being into the mix. There's a lot of expectations, but the question remains: he's young, he's coming into a new situation with the NHL, and then there was questions: should the Buffalo Sabres go ahead and facilitate a trade for Connor Hellebuyck? Now that's no longer a thing, with Connor Hellebuyck getting his extension with the Winnipeg Jets, or someone like a John Gibson as well, who maybe wants out of Anaheim. So what do you make of Devon Levi and the expectations for him, and also the goalie tandem for the Buffalo Sabres, because they are currently carrying 3 goalies with Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen and Eric Comrie on the roster?
I mean, the way ever since they acquired Devon, I mean, Kevin Adams it's clear how high he is on him. And I mean, Devon he's taken a bit of a different path, but he's always had the talent, and he's been known for, like, back in Montreal, even before he was drafted, there was, people knew about, people in the community sort of in the hockey community knew about him. And he's got a really strong mental makeup and he's got the talent. The size is obviously people question, but smaller goalies have made it. I mean, you look at Saros, and that's one of the guys he says he looks up to as, proof that he can do this. And I mean, he has all the tools. He has the athleticism, and just he's excelled wherever he's gone. And this will be something different for him because the grind of the NHL season is like anything else, isn't like anything else. And you don't have, college, you're playing on the weekends or whatnot. This is going to be different, and, learn how to take care of your body better. But he certainly appears to have one. He seems to be the front runner to start in their season opener against the Rangers. And he certainly seems like he's the guy. He won't necessarily play 60 games, but we'll see how they split it. Don Granato said on Wednesday that he didn't have a specific plan in mind for how the 3 goalie rotation will go. They'll just sort of play it by ear, or see how everything factors in, maybe opponent, maybe just travel or whatnot. But he didn't say those things specifically, but they'll see how it goes. But they like the fact that they have these 3 goalies that can push each other. It's it's a competition, and they get along really well. And it'll be interesting to see who ends up being his backup, who ends up taking more of the backup role.
Yeah, and with I remember the situation with the Buffalo Sabres goaltending is because Craig Anderson was only starting once a week basically, and because of the whole waivers exempt from the guy from even before Devon Levi came into the picture of sending someone down as far as a paper transaction, but actually not sending them over to Rochester and bringing in an extra forward or a defenseman as well, and then bringing them back when there's a start. Do you think that Kevin Adams and Don Granato would do something on an off day where Devon Levi is not starting?
I don't think so. I don't think they'll make any paper moves, because right now, I mean, they have a roster spot for goalie. They're not in any rush to create another roster spot. But injuries change a lot of things. It's, all it takes is one guy getting knocked up, and you need to call someone up, and you don't have the roster spot. So that could be an option. I'm trying to think. There are some other players who are still also waiver exempt, but I don't think they want to do that. But if the situation calls for it, maybe they will. But I think that I would think eventually at some point they'd like, probably sooner rather than later, get the goalie situation settled and have 2, because 3 is not ideal, because you're not, one guy is, or 2 guys aren't getting enough reps necessarily in practice. So whoever's getting the start or whatever will get the bulk of the reps, but then you've got 2 other guys splitting, which is not always ideal. So I think it will be figured out some way, one way or another. When, who the heck knows?
Mm-hmm. One other question before we transition over to segment number 3 is recently on 32 Thoughts, Elliot Freeman was talking about the Florida Panthers being in on Patrick Kane. And for me personally, I think it's very doubtful that they can fit it salary cap wise for the Florida Panthers as well, for their injuries and LTIR space as well. But with the expectations, which we'll get into Buffalo's playoff chances in segment number 3, but with Patrick Kane being from the area and with the all amount of cap space that the Buffalo Sabres have, and there's apparently a good relationship between Patrick Kane and people in the organization. What do you make of the possibility of him signing with the Buffalo Sabres this year once he's healthy?
Yeah, I think it'll depend on where the Sabres are at when he gets healthy. I'm sure they're keeping their eye on it. It's, like Kevin Adams says, like he's always making phone calls, whether it's with other teams or whatnot. That's what a good GM does, is they've always got their ear to the ground and paying attention to what's going on. Kevin Adams was in Chicago when Patrick Kane was a rookie. It was his rookie year. So he knows him from that time. So that relationship goes back a while. But I think if that does happen, I think it'll just depend on when he's ready to go and what the Sabres look like at that point. If they feel they need him, and, like they're not going to go anything long-term with him. If he wants more than a year, I can't see that happening. There's too many forwards that are pushing, that are, they want to let some of their players graduate. He's not, Kevin Adams doesn't want to block anybody. So if whenever he's healthy enough and they feel it's a good fit, originally I would have, a few years ago would have thought, no, it'll never happen. But then, you hear Kevin Adams talk about him, you think, okay, maybe it's possible. I just don't know. I think it'll depend on what the situation is with the Sabres at that time.
Yeah, health is definitely a factor for him, and you don't want to put more than 1 year of term
Yeah.
as well because of that. And with the turnaround of the Buffalo Sabres looking to be in a positive trajectory as well, that definitely could be that possibility of him signing there once he is healthy. But we're going to transition over to segment number 3, where we're going to discuss the Buffalo Sabres playoff chances and where they stand, where Heather thinks they stand between the other 3 Atlantic Division teams in Detroit and Ottawa as far as breaking through to make the postseason. We're going to discuss that and more here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. But first, we're going to tell you all about Sleeper. And the NHL season is finally here. And will the Florida Panthers have the season we've been yearning for? I absolutely love the NHL, and I know you do too. And that's why I want to tell you all about the Sleeper app. The Sleeper app is the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network, and it's my go-to for fantasy sports, especially daily fantasy hockey. With Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash on daily fantasy. Once again, with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash on daily fantasy hockey. And you can use the promo code Locked On NHL to get a $100 match on your first deposit. Yes, $100 match when you use promo code Locked On NHL on the Sleeper app. The NHL has never been more exciting with studs like Connor McDavid, Alexander Ovechkin, Sidney Crosby, Cale Makar. You can pick more or less on the stats for these stars like goals, assists, saves, plus, minus, and more. You heard me, Panther fans. 100 times payout on Sleeper. So start paying attention and get your picks right so you could win big. So use promo code Locked On NHL and you'll get a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's Locked On NHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. Welcome back to this Thursday, October 12th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day here on a Thursday. Once again, doing another preseason divisional episode where on today's show we have Heather Engel, NHL.com correspondent for the Buffalo Sabres. And I know you've heard the conversation so many times throughout the offseason of 1 point short, the Buffalo Sabres who can score at will, basically. Led the league in goals with over 4 a game. I think it was 4.12. I don't know the exact number, but it was somewhere around that range. But now, like we mentioned with Devon Levi being part of the mix, the hope is that those goals go down. The penalty kill with Eric Johnson and Connor Clifton as being part of the mix. And we didn't even really go into detail with Rasmus Dahlin getting the extension expected to be in the Norris conversation once again. Owen Power hasn't even gotten his extension yet out of the University of Michigan. Mackie Samoskiewicz's former teammate, but there is that class in the Atlantic Division. We know of the Torontos, Floridas, Tampa Bay. Boston is a little bit of a question mark with their turnover, but then there's those 3 who are trying to break through. For personally, there's a question mark on the blue line when it comes to the Detroit Red Wings. Ottawa's having the situation with Shane Pinto where he hasn't been extended yet, and they brought in Vladimir Tarasenko in order to extend Pinto. They're going to have to make a move to trade somebody to fit Pinto in for the contract that he wants. So there's a little bit of questions as far as the center depth for the Ottawa Senators at this point in time. So that gives a lot of runway for the Buffalo Sabres to make the postseason. And I filled out my playoff bracket last night, Heather. I have the Buffalo Sabres in the postseason and breaking their playoff drought. What says to you as someone who's has seen this team every single day for the last 6 years, especially covering them in the media and talking to players, GMs, coaches. What says you about where they stand with the 3 teams in the Atlantic, and will they make the postseason?
I'll start with that second part. Yeah, I think they will. I think this is the year they break through. They, you know what, they learned a lot. That last year they showed that they are learning, those lessons that they need to learn, they are learning them. Like when they had to win those tight games and that, down the stretch to be able to be in that playoff mix, they won them. I think, I forget if it was 7-2-1 or 9-2-1 or for their record was, but they were winning those 2 games. Look at that game against Florida in April. It was a tight game, and they could have won that game, but they just, they just didn't. But they've gotten close. They've learned how that, you don't need to, yes, they can win a game 6-5, but they can also win a game 2-1, 3-2, those tight knit games, which is what you're going to get more often than not in the playoffs. So, yeah, so I think they've shown what they've learned there, and there's a very strong belief. They're very confident that they can make it, and they believe in themselves, and they believe in their coach, and they believe in what everything that's being done and what they can do, and now it's up to them to show it. But I think they can do it.
And what about comparing them to the other teams in the Atlantic Division, like Ottawa and Detroit?
Yeah, I'd say Ottawa's probably closer to where, to breaking through more than Detroit. I don't know, Detroit sort of seems to be a lot of pieces just being thrown in. Ottawa seems to be a little better in putting those pieces around them. But it just, I mean, but Ottawa without, until they get that Pinto thing resolved, and, it's a lot of, you're losing a big part of their offense. And it just, yeah. And they hope Jacob Chikrin can stay healthy. That'll be a big thing. And, Jake Sanderson is good, and I think he'll take the next, he'll take a next step. I know there's always comparisons between him and Owen Power, but they're two different, their styles. They're different defensemen. You can't compare them. But yeah, Ottawa is probably closer to breaking it, I think. But I mean, if I suppose there's a chance Ottawa goes in, I don't know, but I feel like the Atlantic Division will probably take up maybe 5 spots. It's possible. I just, because of Buffalo and Ottawa, there's maybe more chance for 5 Atlantic teams to get in there. But I think Detroit's still a few steps back. They don't have necessarily that game-breaking talent that Buffalo has, and that Ottawa has a few. Ottawa has fewer, but still has some game-breaking talent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I do think what the Detroit Red Wings do have going for them is goaltending in Ville Husso. A little bit of a rough end of the season as well, but we've seen what Ville Husso can do when he is definitely at his best. Jake Wallman and Moritz Seider as the top pair. I'm that's one of the best. That's one that I really like as well. But as far as the bottom 2, a little bit of question marks there as well for the Detroit Red Wings as well. And what kind of Joonas Korpisalo are we going to see from the Ottawa Senators as well? Are we going to see Bubble Korpisalo as well? That's the big question for the Ottawa Senators as they sign him to a contract, and Cam Talbot now with the LA Kings and all. The matchups this year for the Florida Panthers between the Buffalo Sabres won't be until February this year. It won't be until February 15th in Sunrise, February 27th in Buffalo, and then April 13th in Buffalo. So it's going to be a while until the Florida Panthers and the Buffalo Sabres meet this season, and maybe those will mean something as far as playoff implications, as well as far as seeding in the Atlantic Division. So the as far as the NHL and the Buffalo Sabres, the league, it kind of feels like the Raiders if you're comparing NFL to NHL. When the Raiders are in the postseason, I feel like the league is in a better place. And I feel that way about the Buffalo Sabres. I believe that the league, the NHL in as a whole, is better when the Buffalo Sabres are in the postseason. But Heather, I want to thank you so much for joining me on this edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. If you have any last words, feel free to use them. But if not, plug in your stuff and tell everybody where they can follow you online.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, it's, you can find my stuff on NHL.com. I know the website's a little new, but you can find me on there, and on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, Engel Heather, and I'm also on Blue Sky. It's my last name and then my first name, and whatever the rest of those that handle is. I don't remember what it is, but yeah, you can search me up. My bio is up in there, and you can find me. Yeah, that's how you can find me. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Easy to remember for sure. Thank you so much. And if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to the podcast to be notified every single time the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast jumps into your podcast feed. Don't forget to also subscribe to the other shows on the Locked On NHL network, including Locked On NHL, Locked On Fantasy Hockey with Flip Livingstone and Steer Roden, and Locked On NHL Prospects. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. And everydayers, make sure you come back later today on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, as we are going to preview opening night between the Florida Panthers and the Minnesota Wild, as the Panthers will be taking the ice on Thursday night, 8 p.m. from the XL Energy Center in St. Paul, Minnesota. So I'm Armando Velez with Heather Engel, and you've been listening to the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day.